What's up, music lovers? Thank you so much for clicking on my channel, and today is episode 4 of a series I'm doing called Artists That Deserve More Love. And this is where we just take a moment to appreciate those musicians and bands that do not get as much attention as they deserved. And these can be bands that have had careers lasting decades but just never got the same acclaim or commercial success that their peers did, or they can be artists with 10 followers on Spotify. But whatever the case is, they all make really good music that you should go check out. So without any further ado, let's just get right into it. The first artist in this episode is Canadian heavy metal band Cauldron. They were formed in 2006 and their debut album was released in 2009, but after listening to it, you would be forgiven for thinking that it came out in 1981. Cauldron was one of the bands that would be part of what was called at the time of the new wave of traditional metal, which were a series of bands in the late 2000s, early 2000s and 10s, which took a tremendous amount of influence from the new wave of British heavy metal. Hence the name. Although you might be put off when you hear that and you may think to yourself, why would I listen to Cauldron? They're probably not that unique. And although their music is not the most unique, it is still really fun to listen to because of the sheer amount of love that is so evident when you listen to their music. They're just so unapologetically playing the style of metal that they want to play, and it's really cool to listen to. It's just always fun to listen to any musician or artist just be like, I don't care what anyone else thinks. This is what I love, I'm gonna do it. I don't care if snobs look down on me. I don't care if it's outdated. This is us. And with that being said, even though Cauldron is not the most unique sounding band, they still carve out a style that is distinctively their own. The style is also just fun to listen to. They're like Angel Witch with a touch more of thrash metal and a more doomy atmosphere. Another aspect of their music that I really like is one that's kind of hard to define, but just something that I associate with a lot of the early heavy metal bands from the 70s and early 80s, and that is that when you listen to their music, you can almost feel the fog from whatever bog they're hanging out in come out of the speakers. Or maybe that's just all the smoke from the pot they're smoking. Either way, there is just sort of this kind of analog sound to the recording that, like I said, is hard to define, but really adds to the atmosphere of the band. So if you want to listen to a band that has chunky riffs and listening to them makes you feel as though you are wandering through a misty English countryside at night and you are about to come across some sort of forsaken pagan ritual or some witch or something like that, listen to Cauldron, because that's the vibe that their music kind of gives you. If you want to get into Cauldron and you want some specific songs to listen to, I would recommend anything from their first album, Chained to the Night. I'd say start out with songs like Dreams Die Young, Conjure the Mask, Midnight Hour, and Young and Hungry. If you like that first album and you want to hear more, I would recommend songs like All or Nothing, Miss You to Death, Tomorrow's Lost. And on one last note, I just want to say the artwork for their albums Tomorrow's Lost and New Gods, pretty sick. Those are pretty cool album covers. Okay, and the next artist I want to talk about for this episode is shred guitar legend Tony MacAlpine. Now, Tony MacAlpine was one of the many insanely technical instrumental guitar players that emerged in the mid to late 80s. So if you are a guitar player, you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, I know who Tony MacAlpine is. He's awesome. If you're not a guitar player, you might be thinking, who's Tony MacAlpine? I've never heard that name before. Which is why I wanted to make sure I talked about him in this episode, because although Tony MacAlpine has had a very successful career, he never quite got the same attention other guitar players from his era did, like Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Yngwie Malmsteen, you know, all those guys. And one of the things that I think sets Tony MacAlpine apart from his contemporaries, those previously mentioned guitar players, is that MacAlpine is as good of a piano player as he is a guitarist. He quotes a lot of Chopin in his music, and having that romantic composer influence I think really sets the overall tone of his songs apart. His songs from this era have a more surreal and dreamlike quality than a lot of the other guitar players I mentioned. Add to that just the quality of the production for a lot of those albums and how precise they are. There's a couple of his songs where you can actually hear the pick scraping across the strings. Like, that's how crystal clear everything is for those recordings. And that's something that not a lot of guitar players from that era had, that once again I think sets him apart. And then you add in that insane shredding and neoclassical feel. I think that Tony MacAlpine has a lot to offer, especially if you like a guy like Yngwie Malmsteen. Yngwie Malmsteen has Paganini and Mozart and Bach, while Tony MacAlpine has Chopin and Beethoven as his main classical influences. So if you want to have a bit of a contrast, that's kind of how I would describe them. So if you want to get into Tony MacAlpine, in my opinion, the best album by him I've heard is Maximum Security. My favorite songs from that album are Etude 4, Opus 10, which is a piano track where he quotes Chopin that goes into the next song, The Vision. The combination of those two songs, I think, is just the highlight of the album. I also really love the song Dream State, which, as the name implies, has a very dreamlike and surreal quality to it. If you like those songs and that album, another really great album that I've heard by him that I would recommend getting into is Concrete Gardens, which came out in 2015. And like I said before, Tony MacAlpine never got quite the same level of recognition as some of the other guitar players from his era, which is certainly a shame because based on listening to Maximum Security and some of his newer albums, he's been able to keep the quality pretty consistent throughout the decade, so he's worth checking out. Okay, so the final act for this episode of Artists That Deserve More Love is going to be American heavy metal band Metal Church. I guess for this episode in particular, I'm just really digging the underground 1980s sound, even though Cauldron wasn't from the 1980s. Just like with Tony MacAlpine, a lot of you may have already heard of Metal Church. Their self-titled debut album came out in 1984, just as thrash metal was becoming a thing, and Metal Church kind of got lumped in with the whole thrash metal movement. Even though I don't think thrash metal is technically the best way to describe their music, certainly some similarities there, but they're a bit more melodic, maybe a bit more traditional heavy metal, although they still are pretty heavy. For their first two albums, they had David Wayne as their singer, and therefore had a bit more melody that I think kind of set them apart from being just strictly a thrash metal band. Their music is sort of traditional heavy metal, it's sort of thrash, it's sort of power metal, and at times it even kind of flirts with like early progressive metal, you know, like Fate's Warning or Watchtower or early Dream Theater, but it never really commits to just one style. It's always kind of like in between all those different subgenres. So if you want a band that's kind of like early Queensryche, but heavier like early Metallica, and you haven't listened to Metal Church, I think they'd probably really do it for you. And in all honesty, if we are considering them to just be a straightforward thrash metal band, I think their debut album might be my second favorite debut from a thrash metal band, second only to maybe Killing Is My Business by Megadeth. And unfortunately, while Metal Church definitely had success, they never really took off the way Queensryche, Metallica, or Slayer did. I think a reason for that might be because they never really fit into a specific subgenre in the late 80s. They weren't quite thrash, but they definitely weren't hair metal. They had some progressive tendencies, but they never went all out with it. By the time Metal Church was just kind of starting to take off, the 1990s came and the entire music scene changed. In addition, in the late 80s, they had some heavy competition to deal with. They had to deal with albums like Operation Mindcrime, And Justice for All, Seasons in the Abyss, Appetite for Destruction kind of crowding out the market. With that being said, they've still been able to live off their music for decades, which is more than most musicians ever get. I just wish that they had become a bigger band, because I think, especially when you look at some of the bands that did take off, Metal Church could have been one of those bands. Like I said, they're super successful, but I just wish they got a little bit more attention. That's why the series is called Artists That Deserve More Love, not artists that nobody has ever heard of. So there you go, episode 4 of Artists That Deserve More Love. Thank you so much for watching. If you think this channel deserves more love, please like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. I know it's a cliche to ask, but it really does help the channel grow, and I greatly appreciate it, so thank you in advance for that. Once again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you at the next video.